Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Dan Howells, your host for the Performance Strategies and Stumbles podcast. We have Steve Thompson again for part 2 today. Last week was a fantastic episode on practical takeaways using VBT in the weight room. And today he shares some of his stumbles. But before we go to the episode, just want to mention that there's an opportunity to win £600 worth of mentorship support from Collaborate Sports. All you've got to do is enter the competition. You can use the link in the show notes to do so. That's it from me here. Let's move on to the episode now with Steve. So welcome back to part 2 here with Steve Thompson in terms of the Performance Strategies and Stumbles podcast. And we're digging into the practitioner errors, mistakes, stumbles along the way for Steve. So I'm going to hand straight to you, Steve. Like when I asked you to think about the mistakes you've made, what things have sprung to mind? What have you reflected on?
So firstly, thanks for the question, because it's not something you think about. You often strive away from the mistakes, but actually it's been quite a nice little process to really think back about where did I not necessarily do the best. And I think something, and this actually then links into a very recent meeting I had with some other practitioners in one of my roles that I do with GB Diving around coaching philosophy and how I approach coaching. One of the early mistakes I made, and this is sort of general mistake, is not really considering the athlete in the overall programming training solutions decision. Coming from academia, coming from undergrad, masters, going more or less straight into sort of technical work and lecturing, I kind of was almost built that the research is the golden ticket. That's what we should be thinking about. That's what we should be basing our work on. We should be undertaking these really extensive and in detail needs analyses that consider physiological, neuromuscular, biomechanical demands and principles and all that kind of stuff. And then it's my job to tell them what they need to do. And the more I did that, and importantly, the more I reflect back on that, I just don't think that is the best way to approach it. And it's not what I do anymore. I think you really have to consider the athlete in that whole process. You know, if we think about the MDT or the IDT or whatever the term we're kind of using at the moment, often that athlete is central, and rightly so. They should be central because we're working for that athlete in a sense. But actually, there's no reason in my head that athlete shouldn't be sat around the table as well as being in the table and being able to feed into the decisions that we make and the decisions that we ask them to go out and do. Because ultimately, who knows the athlete better than themselves? They've got lived experiences. They know how their body feels. They know how they feel after given stimuluses. They know how they feel in and around competition. And actually, by including them in that equation, we can really learn a lot. We can learn a lot, and we can make sure that program and that approach is optimal. And I just never did it. I was probably quite naive and arrogant in a sense.
Let's get into it then. Let's get into like what that looked like, because that will be really useful for listeners who might go, yeah, do you know what? I actually do that, and I didn't realize until Steve just mentioned it. Was the process information gathering, needs analysis, decision made, program designed, turn up 1 minute before the session, tell the athlete? You use the word tell there. Is that how it manifested, or like what did it look like?
Yeah, more or less. I think, don't get me wrong, I wasn't sort of robotic in that sense. I held conversations with the athlete, but that conversation was the start of the session. How are you feeling? You know, blah, 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 blah. This sort of stuff we maybe talked a little bit about in part 1. But my program was fixed. And I think one of my downfalls, still to this day a little bit, but certainly back in the day when, 10 years ago, was my ability to be flexible in the moment, my ability to be creative in the moment. If I planned this perfect little program, an athlete came to me and said, I've got a dodgy back today, can we do something else? Like a rabbit in the headlights. I just couldn't get out of that. Well, this is my plan. This is what I need. I know I need to do. How am I going to move away from that? And I think it was something that it took me a long time to get out of that kind of that approach.
If the athlete turned up with that, sore back, etc., what did you feel emotionally? Did you feel that was a threat on you and your program, that if they didn't do that back squat, for example? Or and was your response naturally, okay, you can't do lower body, you couldn't think on the fly there? What were the natural responses?
Yeah, it was more the latter, I suppose. Very in the very early days, and I was lacking confidence, I was lacking experience. I knew, I had my certain biases to certain exercises and approaches, and it would be a case of, right, well, it would almost be like, well, can you squat with a lighter load? Because my head wouldn't compute being able to then, well, why don't we leg press? Why don't we do a goblet squat? Why don't we do some kind of split squat to reduce the torque and the tension on the lower back? There was none of that computed in my head, or if it did, it would compute way after the fact, and I'd think, that's what I should have done. I should have done that.
Does this come because there'll be, you and I are both in education, right, and academics, and there'll be students that go through this process now, and they're learning explicitly about exercises and intensities, and that they tend to match them up, right? Back squat's a really good one to do for 80-85% of strength gain, and it sounds like you were trying to solve the problem with the exercise. Still, the exercise was the solution, whereas actually the whole thing about programming is a modulation of intensity and volume. That's a principle, and our exercises are just the methods upon which we deliver them. And I look back to same experiences myself as a young coach, going, okay, well, it was either we shouldn't do any weights today, or it was, oh well, let's just move it lighter. And actually, I was probably deconditioning the athlete in that sense. I was taking them a step backwards. I was moving further away from any stimulus that I needed for them in a grand scheme of an athletic development plan. And I think that's probably the one thing I hear now is that clarity of like principle driven programming as opposed to exercise driven.
Yeah, 100%. And that's a really good point. They come in with an issue. All right, we won't do S&C today. That would have also been a default for me. Oh, if you've got a bad back, all right, we'll leave it for today. And it might be body. Yeah, exactly. And it's like it was almost that was me. I think I feel reflecting back anyway, that was me shying away from the hard decisions or the challenges and thinking it's easier just to leave it, so I'm going to leave it. Do you know what I mean?
Think it feels like a risk, doesn't it? Somebody's presented to you something that probably gets presented as a crisis in our mind. Okay, this is a problem. I can't problem solve that back issue for you, but I can work around the issue. And again, it comes back to that question alluding to the way we get educated. I was there myself, but what would you give as a bit of advice to people listening who maybe are going through that development stage, feeling that themselves now? What would be your guidance as a mentor to try and help them learn from your mistake there? What should they be doing for themselves?
I think the easiest way to come up with these solutions is to go and do it. So go and train. I'll hold my hands up and say, when I was an early kind of practitioner, I wanted to be an S&C coach, but I didn't train. I didn't train properly. I didn't train effectively. I was very much kind of the opposite of the type of coaches you might see today in terms of they're big trainers and they just fall into S&C because it's something that they love. They love to train. I love to train now, but 10, 15 years ago, I wasn't really in that space. So I think I didn't have the underpinning experience of, right, well, if I can't back squat, I can do this today, or I can do this, or I can do this, or I can do this. And I just didn't try enough. So I think that is just a real simple way of go and do some. I tell my students all the time, go and train. If you're not training, go and train.
I think that's amazing for you to open up about that, because I think there's two types of person, and I don't think we can be both through our learning years. We've got these very academically driven, theory-based, understanding those principles, or we're very application-based, experiential. It's very hard for the emerging coach to join those dots unless they're encouraged into that. So I thank you for sharing that, because that's what I do as well. So I call it, you've got to get reps under the bar. And if I think about all the people that I've worked with in S&C and physio, or even taught, students I've seen excel at greater rates than other people, or young coaches emerge as practitioners through their career, quite fast rates of improvement, have been ones that have got the experiential side of it to bring to life the theory and have experience of what it feels like to move 85% load. understand what it feels like to move the equivalent intensity on a leg press on a single leg, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And essentially, we're coaches who need a number of different tools within a toolbox to resource at any one time. And exercises are part of that toolkit, but it's understanding the right method for the right application. So I think that's cool that you have reflected in that way, because it's something I think people don't own up to and don't get hold of quite early on in their career. So that's really, really cool. In terms of like other sides of your career, whether it's dealing with injuries, conflicts, difficult situations, emotional problems you've encountered through work, what other things have you reflected on in terms of the stumbles across your career that have been lessons learned as well?
Yeah, I suppose creating an identity as an S&C coach, I always struggled with. I've definitely, I think even to this day, I still do suffer from imposter syndrome a little bit. And kind of in certain situations, I'd be like, I mean, I don't know if I should be here. Even though I back myself, I back myself as a coach, as a practitioner. I think, I'm supportive of what I can do. It's just, I get into that mindset. So I think in my earlier days, certainly within the football environment, I tried so many different approaches to what kind of coach I wanted to be, whether I wanted to be the hard ass disciplinarian, the best mate, the hype guy, the kind of the comforting person that says, okay, well, the solution based coach. And I tried all these different approaches, and none of them landed. None of them landed because I don't think they were me. It wasn't that I was almost acting, trying to be a different person. So I think over time, and I've got more experience, I've got more confident, I've got more knowledge, kind of just fallen into being a coach that represents me as a person better, kind of holds my values in position. And I think, I get so much better response from athletes, no matter who they are. Work with so many different athletes over recent years, and I can get those responses. I can build those relationships in those environments now.
So what does that look like then? You've given examples of the hard-nosed, the best mate, the critic, and these are all types of what I talk to mentees about hats that they do have to consider wearing at certain times.
Yeah.
Some more than others. But so what if somebody came in and saw you coach, and what type of coach or what identity would they see?
So I suppose this goes back to the coaching philosophy type question, which, again, I'm not, I do have one, but articulating it isn't always the simplest, I don't think.
Yeah.
But I think I would describe myself as an educator. I think I would be, an athlete-centered educator that tries to drive autonomy within the S&C room. So, or with it on field, whatever the type of approach. So I like to try and educate. I like to provide those rationales, but do it in a way that computes with the person in front of me. So if they're studious, I'll give them the physiology if they're interested in that. If they're not, I'll give them, right, this is how it's going to make you better at whatever you're doing. And I think that's a really key part for me is to get that. But I think you're right. You have to be able to have those hats. I've been in situations where I have had to stop a session and say, right, this isn't good enough. But I think from my perspective, if I do that only when I have to, I get the response that I want. If I'm myself, that is, can have a laugh, kind to people, listen, ask how they are, take an interest in their lives outside of the sport, then if I have to go down that route, or if I want to have if we want to have a fun session, or if that athlete is just feeling pretty rubbish, I'm able to put my arm around them as well and say, right, let's actually have a proper conversation here. And I think that's such an important part of it all.
So it sounds like there's the difference between adapting your style authentically and trying to be something that is way out of your comfort zone, so far removed from who you are as a person, because you feel it needs to fit the environment.
Yeah.
That sounds like the disconnect there. So then let me reframe the question, put you on the spot here. Does that give you a self-awareness now of where you are best suited to coach versus not coach? And so in your formative years of your career, were you looking to try and be on the ground in a rugby club and working with 45 players, but now you have a niche that is more individual athletes, small groups? I don't know, just
good
because
question. Good
it's
question.
naturally where people go, isn't it? I want to go work for a team, but actually, if they know themselves better, would that get them further on their career faster because they know themselves better? Does that fall into it, do you think, in any way?
I don't know, because I think the analogy used earlier around sort of reps under the bar kind of works in this instance. I think you have to be exposed to lots of different environments to help build that philosophy, to help build that identity as a coach. So even to this day, I work with 3 or 4 athletes in a gym at one time, and I work with 20 to 25 players out on a field at one time. So I am spanning that, large group to small group type, individual type approach. And I would say that my coaching is different, but I don't think I'm a different coach in those instances. I think I've figured out what works with the majority of people that I come across these days. And I don't feel like, whilst I can have those hats to pull out if I need to, I often don't need to, or if I do, I can do it, and it can be effective. So I don't think I look for opportunities that interest me, that I think I could offer something to, and that I think might progress my career, or is something, do you know what, I just really fancy having a go at that. And that's how I'll make decisions on if I'm going to go for roles or if I'm going to get consultancy work or whatever. I don't think it's based on, I'm this kind of coach, therefore I want to go and coach this kind of athlete or this kind of within this setting.
Yeah, nice. I like that. So then, again, probing you again for another stumble reflection and mistakes you've made. Is there anything you look back on your career and laugh at, like in terms of, I can't believe I did that, or I can't believe that's the way I dealt with the programming in that way? You talked about how you were quite dictatorial, I guess, in your program design originally. Is there anything else you've reflected on?
I suppose there's always kind of, and don't put me on the spot and ask for examples because I haven't got any at the minute, but there's always sessions that you look back on and think, my God, that was a train wreck. And every coach, I think, if we're going to kind of look a bit more philosophically, then they're the sessions that often you get more out of, because if it goes terribly wrong, you're kind of, you know that you can reflect on that easier. It's easier to reflect on mistakes, hence this podcast. It's easy to reflect on those mistakes and those stumbles than it is the things that went really well, I think. So that, of course, the sessions that I look back on, even probably to not in the so distant past, that I'm like, that just didn't work. That just didn't work. And I think, why on earth did I try and do that? I suppose one example, which isn't necessarily laughable, but is working within club football with a group of 20 lads and only 2 squat racks. I'm trying to be very, very specific in my programming that complements on-field work, so acceleration, max V, and some of those sessions that I might have put together there's just too much going on. It's too busy, and you've got players messing around, you've got players waiting around, and you take a step back and you think, just didn't work. You need to strip that back. So I suppose, there's always sessions like that you can think that just wasn't good.
Yeah, and I've been there myself, where it's just not flowed, or you've set it off on the wrong tone. I always made a big point about informing athletes about the program design and what we were doing in new blocks. And as a decision around informing them, it was a really good decision, but the application sometimes was very, very poor. You talked at the beginning of the episode about meetings and a reference to something that happened recently. Was that an MDT meeting, or?
Oh yeah.
How it manifests?
It was something new. I'd not necessarily come across it in the past. It's called a technical scrum, and it was a number of different practitioners around sort of a virtual table, because it was via Zoom, and we started off by discussing, because it was the first real one we'd done. So it started off by discussing philosophies and approaches to our own specific programs from the different sites, and then started to delve into the weeds of what is it we do within our programs that directly inform performance. And it was just a real nice challenge, or a nice ability to reflect on yourself, reflect on your programs, be challenged within a space that was respectful, and that everyone was sort of pulling in the right direction, in the same direction, and created some real some real good discussions essentially, and it left me at the end thinking, I actually can't wait for the next one. I think the next one's going to be great because we're going to go even deeper into some of these technical aspects of the sport, and then how our program directly feeds into that. So it was just a really healthy kind of approach to the meeting.
I guess the previous story about stumbling with regards to just writing your program irrespective of the environment, the people, the context, is the polar opposite, right? Of doing things based on textbook and what you feel is right. What was it that drove that technical scrum, as you talked about? Was it an external individual? Was it a concept you'd seen it elsewhere? Was it something you generated? Like, how did you come across that strategy itself?
Yeah, so it was the kind of the lead, the head of the department essentially within the organization. So they they've got, years and years of experience, really, really well renowned for kind of managing MDTs. So he came in and said, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And I just sort of went along with it. So it was really like a really refreshing experience for me. It was nice.
Nice, cool. And then in terms of like, you must be in a role of managing other people now, like in places, whether that's in your academic routes or whether it's in with teams. Is there anything from a leadership point of view that you've stumbled on, you've had errors with, whether that's in, for me, for example, I made a mistake earlier in my career, being quite a little bit too direct with my feedback at one point. Right. And I really burnt some bridges with some peers. And luckily, a mentor guided me to say, do you realize how that came across? And I was able to build that bridge. And that all came down to sort of self-awareness about me again, just like you've talked about authenticity and identity as a coach. But looking in that realm as somebody who's now probably leading people as well, any mistakes there that you slipped up with or things you struggle with now? Like, I think it's important to talk about what you still struggle with. We all still struggle with things.
Yeah. I think probably the main thing I'd go to is just that the relationship, but a little bit maybe linked to what you just said there in terms of managing that relationship, because typically I'll be looking after students. They might be on my course, they might be on a different course, and we might be in an environment that's outside of the university. So it's managing that relationship that means there is kind of a nurturing environment, but it's not too frenzy, if that makes sense. I think that's something I struggle with because I can be a different person, let's say in a football club, than I would be in the classroom. And I think that's right. I should be a different person because they're completely different environments. So, those individuals that are then kind of under my leadership might see a different side of me. And then that opens the door then to potentially them being different with me in the other situation, maybe in the classroom, for example. So it's, managing that has been a challenge. And I think something I still work on, something I still try and get right, because I don't want to be a closed door. I want to be myself. As we've talked about, it's important for me to coach the way that I feel like I should coach. But then I have to have that sort of peripheral understanding that there are also individuals around me that perhaps shouldn't see that kind of side of me to that extent. So it's a bit of a sliding door, really.
Nice. I want to just wrap up with something that's probably a bit more comfortable for you. I know I've caught you off the spot on a lot of the non-technical things. Like if we go, like you're really well versed in VBT, tech, data, insights, right? A lot of listeners will relate to frustrations with technology, mistakes made with technology. Is there anything we can just hone in on and wrap up here around your experiences of things that you've stumbled with, messed up on in technology-wise, lessons learned that will be really useful for people to take away from this part of the pod?
Yeah, I think lessons learned from technology is technology is there to assist you. Technology is there to assist you, but you are the coach. Do not fall into the trap of either letting the technology be the coach or not doing the coaching because your head is in an iPad. I think that's feedback I've got from a piece of research I did from top level coaches that they felt that sometimes the VBT side, the technology side of things, takes them away from what they should be doing. And that's on the shop floor, in front of the athletes, building the relationships, coaching, doing whatever. So I think, solutions to that problem is firstly, check the tech, make sure it's working, make sure you know how to use it proficiently, that you're not in a situation where you're like, why is this happening? I've never come across this before. Trial and test it in as many different environments and situations that you can, that you know how to troubleshoot. Speak to the tech companies and say, what happens if this happens? Or what do I do if this happens? And then try and make sure that the way you use the technology is short and sharp. So you're not, nice. Your head isn't in the iPad, or your head isn't on a computer typing away. Technology has got to a point now where a lot of it can be done automatically. So you don't need to then be sort of, right, well, if you got that velocity, I need to plug this into my spreadsheet and figure out what the next working load's going to be, and then figure out the velocity loss is going to be, and then work out what that velocity represents, and then make sure I'm watching to make sure that we hit that velocity or whatever. I think we can trust the tech that it's advanced enough that it does a lot of that for us. But definitely make sure that you're still present within the room, which I have made that mistake many a time.
Yeah, same here. And I think if I can just wrap up with you here, is that you've clearly talked about preparation, know the tech, know the troubleshooting. And I feel like that's where a lot of practitioners I've worked with have got it wrong as well, is expecting the technology to be faultless.
Yeah.
Seeing the output at one point and expecting that to be what happens every time. And tech isn't fail-safe. So, and generally, troubleshooting is logical. If it doesn't work, it's because of something in the process somewhere that you might, as a human, have got errors got wrong in that sense. So, and the biggest mistakes I've made, to just give people comfort in the fact they probably made the mistakes, is just things like not being prepared to like charge and think ahead, charging equipment, and have I got the right equipment and the right charge in them for what I need to do? Because there's nothing worse than an athlete feeling you aren't able to deliver on something that you're trying to deliver on. It just shows a lack of confidence. So I think we can both hold our hands up there and give comfort to people listening that
100%.
Generally it's not that hard to get right. It's been a big oversight in terms of preparation. Steve, thank you so much on behalf of everyone listening. Amazing, both episodes here, for sharing so candidly here and giving some real key principles of operation with the VBT use in the strategies part of this podcast. Thank you so much, buddy. I really, really appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Dan. It's been really great experience. I've enjoyed it, so thank you.
Some kind words from Steve there, and I'm really glad it's a reflective process for him as a practitioner that many will look up to, and it's nice to see that we've all made very similar mistakes, especially in that tech space. As I mentioned before, if you'd like to enter the competition to win over £600 worth of mentorship, including access to my community for free, then please do so by looking at the link in the show notes. Next week, we have Jack Oaten, who is part of the NFL Academy, talking about preparing athletes for a combine. I'll leave it at that. I hope you can tune in next week for that episode.